This is Tante Belle Cose, a podcast about the many beautiful things for you to discover in Italy. I'm your host, Danielle O'Terry. I'm the founder of Feast Travel, Arthur Avenue Food Tours, and Cilento Food Tours. Before I start talking about Florence, I just want to pause for a moment to acknowledge my friends and clients who live in Los Angeles. We have one client in particular who lost everything in the fires. So before I go on talking about the dream of travel, which is such a privilege, I just want to acknowledge everybody who is suffering in LA, and I pray those fires end soon. Florence is a very easy city to love. It's small, it's walkable, and it's exactly what you want Italy to be. Its ancient buildings, cobblestone streets, and the surrounding hills look like they belong on a bottle of olive oil. And from the city center, you can just walk directly into those hills. But the main reason that you should visit Florence is art. The field of art history as we know it today is really based around the study of the Italian Renaissance in Florence, and specifically the works of art that you can see just walking around the historic center. You are essentially inside of an art history textbook. So a day of exploring is deeply rewarding, even if you're not, quote unquote, a museum person. And here's why. Many of the treasures of the Italian Renaissance are in the Uffizi Museum, and it's definitely a worthy experience. But the works of art there are dismembered from their original setting. This is to say, these are works of art that were created for churches, chapels, and palaces. And in a museum, you have the opportunity to look at these works of art, organized and interpreted by curators. But you're not seeing the entire story. When you have the chance to see a work of art in the place where it was designed to be situated, you are also experiencing what the artist wanted you to see and how they wanted you to feel. It's an entirely different experience from a museum. You've got the complete vision of the artist, the light, the sound of footsteps around you. The experience was designed for the viewer, for you, to come inside from the dirty, dusty outside world and have something transformative happen. And the designers and the artists who created these chapels, these frescoes, these spaces for you to enter, they were very conscious of these things. And that's what you can experience so well in Florence. So even if you think art is not your thing, still consider a day of walking in and out of churches. You can always break it up with lots of coffee and gelato breaks because this is the essence of Florence, this most beautiful city. Now, I've spoken a few times on this podcast about overtourism. And there are many cities dealing with it, Barcelona, Tokyo, Paris, but over-tourism in a small city like Florence is pretty bad. The concentration of Airbnbs in the historic center have driven out so many of the locals. I was a graduate student in Florence in 2001, and believe me, there were plenty of tourists then. But that was also before Google Maps, Airbnb, the iPhone, so many things that we rely on heavily today. And the street where I used to shop, Via dei Neri, was filled with little stores where I would get bread and sausage and vegetables. All of those stores are gone now, and there's just one shop that remains, a sandwich shop with an enormous line of people who have seen it on social media and line up for it. That sandwich shop was there all those years ago, but it was just a local place until they kind of Americanized their offering and social media caught on. Now, I know I probably pick on that sandwich shop too much, but my greater point here is that over-tourism in Florence is really a big problem. And over-tourism is exacerbated by the fact that most people are doing just a few of the same things. They're going to grab a glass of wine from a wine window, they're waiting in line for that sandwich, or a copycat sandwich, and there are many around the city, and then they're waiting in line to see Michelangelo's David. Maybe they'll also climb the bell tower or the Duomo. Now, I do endorse seeing the David. He's amazing. But the other two things are causing a lot of problems. And simultaneously, I can't imagine telling anybody not to visit Florence because it is such an incredible city. Art should be your primary motivation for visiting Florence. And if you're truly opposed to this, if you're just rolling your eyes saying, no way, it's not my thing, take Florence off the list. It's just not going to be worth the time and the money for a sandwich. Trust me, there are about 1 million better things to eat in Italy than that sandwich. So if you're curious and your mind is open, but maybe you're on the fence because you don't even know what else to see besides Michelangelo's David, this episode is designed to give you a different perspective, one that will hopefully allow you to have a much more rich and meaningful visit to Florence. Allow me to introduce you to one of my favorite works of art by my favorite Renaissance painter. It's inside the church of Santa Maria Novella, and if that name sounds familiar, that's because that's also the name of the train station, which is right behind this church. And the reason I've chosen this work of art in particular is that it really allows us to look at the parallels between the Renaissance and today. And that's what I always seek to do in my work. Because whenever I go to ancient sites, whether it's Pompeii or this church in Florence, I always notice echoes from the past. And when we see things and understand things from the past, we have the opportunity to understand our present in a different way. It's that hindsight is 20/20 thing. The perspective, the bird's eye view, hopefully helps us make better decisions today. And at the very least, understand our world a little bit better. Now, to enter the church, you will need to wait in line probably for a short amount of time and then pay a fee to enter. It's 100% worth it, and the line really isn't that bad. Certainly nothing like the line to see the David. And the church itself is essentially a museum. But we are going to focus on one single work of art and really just one panel of a fresco that's part of a larger cycle. The artist's name is Domenico Ghirlandaio, and his work is going to set a stage for understanding Florence as a whole. Now, let's go back to the 15th century in Florence. This was a city buzzing with art and commerce and political intrigue. It's a place where wealthy families are competing for power and prestige, and the way they do it is by commissioning breathtaking works of art. And this is what makes Florence, Florence: the extraordinary concentration of wealth and talent. All of these rich people trying to outdo each other by creating the most beautiful works of art. And I want you to think of it like this: frescoes, sculptures that had names attached to them, the very important wealthy people who paid for them, these were essentially like massive PR campaigns. And what they were advertising was their piety, but also their very, very good taste. So I think the best comparison to Renaissance Florence in terms of social structure would be modern-day New York City. And that's also because much of Florence's wealth was based on banking. The Medici family, which is one name that you may know, there's a pretty decent Netflix series about the Medici. Their main industry was banking, but it was deeply tied to textiles and fashion. The Wool Guild and the Weavers' Guilds, these were very important forces that helped build the Duomo. And the Duomo was actually built with private money, not the money of the church, and with the specific goal of being the biggest cathedral in Europe. So much of the art was a show of power and influence. Yes, Florence is the city of Dante, the birthplace of Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and so many other important works of art and literature. But really, Florence was dripping with money and an international scene of people coming in and out for these industries. Now let's enter the church and go inside the Tornabuoni Chapel. The Tornabuoni family, think of them like Bloombergs or Zuckerbergs, had a ton of money. In today's dollars, they would be billionaires. They were the second richest family next to the Medici, and one of them had actually married into the Medici family and was the mother of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who is one of the most important figures in the world of the Italian Renaissance and one of the most important patrons of art in all of history. The Tornabuoni Chapel is actually a reconstruction. The paintings that had been there prior had been damaged by water, and the Tornabuoni took it over with the promise that they were going to reconstruct it and turn it into something beautiful. They promised a small fortune to do this, and they hired the painter Domenico Ghirlandaio to do so, and he really succeeded. This wasn't his last name. Ghirlandaio actually means garland maker, and his father had made a fortune making garlands for the hair of women, which is your first clue that we are dealing with a very swish crowd. It's also believed that a young Michelangelo was an apprentice on this fresco cycle. He may have been holding ladders or building scaffolds or mixing paint, but he famously hated painting. He wanted to sculpt. And after this, he was accepted into the sculpture garden of the Medici family. What I love most about Ghirlandaio's paintings are the natural expressions on the faces of all of the figures he paints. He's deeply invested in details. He does light and texture and nature in such a beautiful and caring way. And the result is that there are so many beautiful things for your eyes to unfold. You'll never get tired looking at a Ghirlandaio painting. So, back to the Tornabuoni family. Giovanni Tornabuoni is the family patriarch, and he was a super savvy businessman. He was the manager of the Medici family bank branch in Rome, so he's commuting back and forth between Florence and Rome, and he's also the treasurer to one of the most important popes in history. And the Tornabuoni family is super ambitious. They even changed their name. Prior, they had a noble title, but the Florence government was a Republican government that didn't allow nobles. So what they did was renounce the title and change their last name from Tornaquinci to Tornabuoni, and that essentially made them popolani, which is to say commoners. And so if I were to draw a parallel to something today, I would say this is kind of like Prince Harry, maybe, giving up his noble title to run for public office in the UK. But of course, money is going to come with more influence, and now we're going to enter the chapel and see it on display. I'm going to walk you through this, so don't worry about pulling up the image on your phone or your computer, though of course you can if you want to. If you do, just Google Birth of the Virgin, Santa Maria Novella, and you will see this one scene in particular with a woman reclining on a very fabulous bed. The cycle of frescoes was painted between 1486 and 90, and what it really is a commentary on Renaissance social society. The main scene that we're going to focus on depicts the birth of the Virgin Mary. So the first thing to notice is that the scene is not set somewhere in the Middle East or any sort of humble setting. It's in a ridiculously luxurious, pimped-out 15th century palazzo. Essentially, this scene is taken and put into a world that looks exactly like the one the Tornabuoni family inhabits. So this would be the same thing as if we were to depict the birth of the Virgin Mary today in a Park Avenue penthouse in New York City. And it's important to note that what Ghirlandaio is doing here is not unusual. Many works of art, most in fact, created during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, are not trying to depict an accurate landscape or clothing or fashion from another time and place. People were much more invested in truth versus fact. And the truth of these stories, their spiritual truth, could be placed in any setting. And in fact, that made them much more relatable. And they were so relatable, in fact, that the scenes, the crowd scenes, are usually stuffed with portraits of the families or the important movers and shakers of the time. And so when you visit Florence and you look at the frescoes and you go from church to church, you will notice these people looking out at you from the crowd scenes. Those are the citizens of Renaissance Florence. Those are their faces. These are the people that made all of these beautiful buildings and monuments that you see around you. And this is what makes Florence's heritage just so special. And this is why I don't want you obsessing over a wine window. It's a glass of wine served through a window. Done, okay? I want you to go inside instead and look at these works of art and see these ambassadors from the past. They're looking at you and they want you to look back. And this is the magic of travel. This is what you can't do looking at this image on a screen or on your phone, even though you should. But when you get to go to a beautiful city like Florence, you get to engage and connect with people from the past, if you let it happen. Now let me walk you through the story. If we start in the upper left-hand corner, you will see a man and a woman embracing at the top of the stairs. This is Joachim and Anna, the parents of the Virgin Mary, and they were considered to be very old and unable to have children. And one day Joachim is out in the fields with his flocks, and he receives a message from an angel that his wife is pregnant. And she receives the same message, and they run to the gates of the city, kiss and embrace. They don't need to say anything because they both know the truth. And the scene is called The Kiss at the Golden Gate. But once again, instead of placing it in some sort of a landscape or a setting that would be contemporary with the story, they've put it inside of this Renaissance palazzo. And as we move down the stairs, we move into the next scene. There is no division between the scenes to tell us that there is a break in time. But if we jump all the way to the other side, we will see Anna once again. Her head is covered, and she's reclining in bed after having just given birth. You'll also notice that she is covered with a really gorgeous blue blanket. The color blue, whether it was for a dye on a textile or in a painting, was very expensive. And so you put the most important person in the best stuff. And by the way, this is usually why we see images of the Virgin Mary wearing blue. There's no historical or religious significance to her wearing blue, but again, you put the most important lady in the best stuff. There are 3 women, perhaps midwives, who are cuddling the beautiful newborn Virgin Mary. The woman that's holding her, she stares directly at the baby, and there's this soft light falling on her face. She has a beautiful and very relatable expression. She's enchanted. And the baby is delicious. She's got these little thighs that you just want to bite, and she's cooing. She's adorable, happy, and healthy. Now, one thing that did unite the lower and the upper classes of Florence and the world until fairly modern times is how difficult it was for a mother and a child to successfully come through a pregnancy. So this is certainly a very happy scene. Next, you'll notice a woman who is pouring water into a basin. And this action really shows us that we are watching a split second in time. We've just walked into the room. The water is in mid-pour. It's not a static image. It's a dynamic one. We even see her dress flowing behind her. And then a third woman has turned around from the baby to look up at the group of women who have just entered the room. Now, just a quick note about the room itself. This palazzo is filled with nods to classical architecture because Renaissance means rebirth, and specifically a rebirth of classical culture. And you'll notice that there's a frieze between the ceiling and the wall, and it has cherubs and putti that seem to be made of marble. But if you look closely, you'll notice that the cherubs and the putti are having a really good time because it's like the architecture itself is celebrating this happy, wonderful moment. Okay, so let's look more closely at the women who have just entered the room. The woman in front has a beautiful profile, gorgeous blonde hair, and she is wearing a fabulous dress brocaded in gold. The women behind her are also dressed quite nicely, but not quite as well. They are handmaidens or staff. Essentially, they work for the main woman, the prima donna, and her name is Ludovica Tornabuoni. She's Giovanni's daughter, and she's about 14 years old here. Now, because textiles and fabric and artisanship were so important in Florence, of course, she is really wearing the very best stuff. Now, I was just at the Garden State Plaza in New Jersey. Yeah, I know you weren't expecting to jump from Florence to Jersey, but bear with me for a minute. There was a med spa right at the entrance of the mall with a chalkboard out front that listed all of the very toxic things that you could inject into your face to look more beautiful. Walk-ins are welcome, by the way. Now, it struck me because I remember that when I used to speak about the beauty practices of women when I was working in a museum many years ago, it sounded bananas. But today, it's like nothing. So the distance between the past and the present really is never that far. So if we look at Ludovica, we can also see some of the things that women were doing to enhance their beauty. First of all, blonde hair was the ideal, and Florentine women were expected to have long, wavy, golden blonde hair. I mean, think of those curling irons that are so popular today and all of the balayage and blonde highlights that women get. In the Renaissance, women had a few different methods for lightening their hair. One was simple, which was just to sit in the sun, but they wanted their skin to remain pale so that they didn't look like peasants who worked in the field. So they wore these special hats that were essentially like visors that would protect their skin but let their hair get bleached. They also used different mixtures and ingredients to make their hair blonde. Those included saffron, onion skin, and horse urine. Yeah, I don't even want to think about the smell. Some were said to be better than others, and many promised to turn their hair like strands of gold in just a few days. Another feature was the coveted high forehead. Now today, Botox especially has made people obsessed with their foreheads. I mean, I'm a woman in my 40s, and I spend a stupid amount of time thinking about my forehead. And that's because, once again, it's a beauty ideal. What women in the Renaissance would do was actually pluck their hairline back to the middle of their head. It sounds really painful, but I don't know. I mean, is it any more painful than a Brazilian bikini wax? In Renaissance Florence, the high forehead was considered to be a sign of both beauty and intelligence. Today, I think it's a sign of beauty and money, or maybe it's money allowing you to defy time and gravity, because Botox isn't cheap, even at that walk-in place. I'm not sure, it's a moving target, but I find it really interesting to contemplate the ideals that we attach to beauty standards, especially as we're living them. The dress that Ludovica is wearing is made from the richest fabrics with tons of gold detailing. It has a low neckline, just enough to reveal a little bit of cleavage, but there's a nice balance between sensuality and modesty. Very demure. And she has large, puffy sleeves that have an overall opulent appearance. Shout out to my Anne of Green Gables fans. If you know, you know. Pale skin was definitely the priority because it symbolized purity, morality, and high social status. So what women did to make their faces whiter was to use powder made with ground alabaster. That's a stone that's very soft and turned into powder easily, and they would mix that with a primer of raw eggs. And sometimes they would even use a lead-based foundation, which, very healthy. They would tint their cheeks and their lips with rouge to have a glowing appearance, and they used kohl as eyeliner and oil on their lashes to make them look darker and thicker. Now, there's one fashion statement from the Renaissance that I hope we keep in the past. And this was the ideal for women to have these very large, wide, dilated pupils. It probably made them look like anime characters or like they were stoned. But to achieve this look, they would put drops of the herb belladonna in their eyes. It's very toxic and made it very difficult to see, and I'm sure a lot of women permanently damaged their vision with belladonna. But the name of the herb, belladonna, means beautiful woman, and it was a commonly used cosmetic. All of these ideals were deeply connected to the phrase, beauty adorns virtue. This was a common sentiment specifically in Renaissance portraiture, and so Ghirlandaio would have been very aware of it when he was painting Ludovica. And it emphasized that true beauty was a combination of physical attractiveness and moral goodness. So these highly self-conscious people were using art, fashion, and makeup to tell us who they were, what they cared about, and how powerful they were. And this is what you can take away from looking at Renaissance art in Florence. It's beautiful, of course, but it's filled with messaging. It's propaganda, politics, power, and influence. And once more, I just want to note that we are looking at only one scene in this fresco cycle. So if you have the opportunity to go to Florence, you'll see many more scenes. And there's an inscription in one of the others that I would like to share with you. It says, "In the year 1490, the most beautiful city for wealth, victories, and commerce, famous for its monuments, enjoyed abundance, health, and peace." Here are a few more things that you could do to tie your experience in Florence back to the Renaissance. The first one is only going to be accessible to a very few people. It's the actual palace of the Tornabuoni family, which still stands. It was also home to the Renaissance Pope Alessandro de' Medici, and it was also home to the world's first documented opera performance. The website says that it has been beautifully restored to its original splendor. It looks kind of modern to me, but it has private residences that are available by membership. So if you have residency rights, you then have access to a selected number of apartments within the palace, and whenever you're in Florence, you can stay there and they'll concierge your way through it. So I will probably never get to stay there, but if you do, invite me over. We'll have a spritz. I want to see the inside. Another experience you can have is to go to the Palazzo Medici Riccardi. It's open to the public, and in particular, view the chapel where there is a cycle of paintings by the Renaissance artist named Benozzo Gozzoli, and they depict the Nativity, Christmas. And you can go inside and sit in the chapel and even pray before these paintings, exactly as the Medici would have. The second thing you can do is much more accessible, and that's to participate in Florence's artisan heritage. Historically, Florence has attracted the best painters and sculptors, but it also has a rich tradition for studios that do paper marbling, gold leaf, jewelry, paintings restoration, and leather making. That's probably the most famous tradition today. When I was studying in Florence, I got to visit the studios of many conservators who have a deep understanding of the craftsmanship employed in the Renaissance. And really, there are very few people alive who know how to repair a damaged piece of Renaissance art. It was an amazing experience to watch them work and to see how careful they are. During my time in Florence, I also took a restoration class. At the time, it was something that I thought I might enjoy doing professionally, until I realized you actually have to be okay with watching paint dry, which I am not. But the professor was cleaning a statue which had been covered with candle smoke over the years, and he was using nothing but a Q-tip and a synthetic version of our own saliva, which sounds disgusting, but it gets worse because really, Orthodox Florentine conservators use their own saliva because they believe the Tuscan diet is also ideal for restoring works of art. So this really shows you how deep these artisan traditions run in Florence. They're even tied to food. But this artisan heritage is also being destroyed by mass tourism, especially when we're talking about leather and jewelry. Tourists want to buy cheap leather, and you can do so at the San Lorenzo market or the Porcellino market, which is the one with the giant statue of the wild boar. But these leather pieces are made in India, and they use very poor quality leather and very toxic dyes. So many of the small shops that sell the real artisan products that are made in private studios, they've been forced to close because of high rent. It's much more profitable to have a copycat sandwich shop and sell spritzes. So, if you're going to Florence, consider carving out a place in your budget for an extra special souvenir that's made by a Florentine craftsman. When you do so, you're not just supporting a local business, but you're helping to sustain a legacy. And I know I probably sound like I'm selling memberships to PBS right now, but I'm really serious about this. It's better to not buy into mass consumption in general when you're in a city like Florence, and instead invest in a really special souvenir that will last a lifetime. It could be a handbag, a wallet, a pair of shoes, a piece of jewelry, or maybe just an inexpensive journal that's made from hand-marbled paper. And if you want to go a little bit deeper, there are also studios available by appointment where you can see demonstrations or even participate. If this is something that you would like to do, get in touch with me. I can help organize a workshop with a paintings restorer that we know, and we can also organize a gold leaf class. Or you could do a tour with our guide in Florence, Elena, and she will take you around the Oltre Arno neighborhood where she lives, and you'll visit some private studios for shopping, and she'll intersperse this with wine and snacks. Thank you so much for listening, and let me know what you think of this episode. This is all still very new, and so I'm interested in listener feedback, and I want to know what you want to know. If you're planning a trip to Italy, consider joining our subscriber community. Now, all episodes are free and always will be, but what subscribers get is access to the private chat feature, where you can ask a question of me or the group anytime that you want, and once a month we have a subscriber-only Zoom, where you can ask me any of your trip planning questions. Now, don't worry if you can't make the Zoom call, you can still email me your questions. I'll answer it live, and then the next day I send out the recording. I can't tell you how much I appreciate these subscriptions. They are giving me fuel, they are giving me ideas, and there are so many new things that I want to share with you. So thank you.